What's up, everyone? I'm here with my NFL Week 14 DraftKings picks. Hope all of you had a very successful Week 13. Wasn't too bad for me. It was a positive return on investment, and that's pretty much all you can ask for week in, week out. As always, you can check the description for my picks last week and how they did. Wasn't too bad of a week, honestly. Had some pretty good picks, had some not so good picks as well. But as expected, the way that I was doing the video last week, in the sense of I was giving out some cash game players and I was giving out some tournament guys. So what I'm going to be doing these final few weeks of the season, because quite a few people are playing more and more tournaments these final few weeks, so they can try to win all the money while they still can. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into this week's picks. Alright, so starting off here with Andy Dalton and Tyler Boyd as my very first Week 14 stack. Shouldn't have to go too deep into the numbers to know why people want to play them, but Andy Dalton and Boyd should be one of the more popular stacks of Week 14 in a week where it looks like there's not that many clear-cut obvious plays, aside from, the LeVeon Bells, the David Johnsons, the Antonio Browns, and a couple other guys sprinkled in there. So we could see some really diverse lineups even in cash games, which is a good thing in my opinion. But again, Andy Dalton and Tyler Boyd should be one of the more popular combos. Now, you could go a different route and stack Andy Dalton with like a Tyler Eifert or maybe even a Brandon LaFell. Personally, I would stay away from LaFell. I like Eifert, but I think 6K is a little bit too steep, even though the Browns do struggle immensely against the tight end position. So I expect Boyd to be the most popular to pair Dalton with. Boyd's been averaging 7 targets since A.J. Green went down with injury, and Andy Dalton has put together actually a pretty good season. He's thrown a touchdown pass in every single game this season except one, dating all the way back to Week 3 against the Denver Broncos. He's been on a pretty good stretch here, so he's playing very well, to be honest. He's managing the game very well. He's working with what he has, and he's making the most of this time. So I like this pairing, and hopefully, they can put together a good game. I think Boyd is a really good play in cash games, and you really can't go wrong with either of these guys, I think, this week. All right, so for stack number 2, I have Phillip Rivers and Antonio Gates. As far as Rivers go, I expect him to be on a lot of people's radar. I don't know how popular he'll actually be. I don't know how many people will actually pull the trigger and put him in their lineups. But I think Rivers is definitely an okay choice. That said, this Panthers team could be a trap for a lot of fantasy players, because they're going to see this Panthers defense and think automatically, I can pick on them. It doesn't matter where they're playing, yada, yada, yada. They're just bad all around. It's not the truth. The Panthers are not that bad at home, especially in the passing defense. They're only allowing about 222 passing yards per game at home, compared to over 330 passing yards per game allowed on average on the road. So, but the big guy that I want to talk about is Antonio Gates, because I think that if you are going to stack Phillip Rivers or anybody, I think Gates is a clear-cut best option in my opinion, especially if Luke Kuechly does not play. Now, if Kuechly has practiced a little bit this week, but that is still part of the concussion protocol, he's still going through that. If I had to guess, I would assume that he's not going to play, but again, I really don't know at this point. If he does play, it's going to downgrade Gates a little bit for me, but the Panthers have allowed the most tight end receiving touchdowns in the NFL, or tied with a few other teams at 9, and they're actually bottom 4 in the league in fantasy points allowed to tight ends at 16.4, I believe it is. So the Panthers are very vulnerable against a tight end right now, and that was even with Kuechly. So if Kuechly is gone, I expect Gates to be a pretty good play, and I would actually consider him a pretty good cash game play in my opinion. There's not too many tight ends that really jump off the board that aren't too expensive. That said, I actually want to talk about the other tight end really quickly on the other team, because I haven't listed him anywhere else, and Greg Olsen. Greg Olsen is actually the cheapest he's been in the past 16 regular season games at $5,000. I expect that this be a really high-scoring game, to be perfectly honest with you. The Panthers actually have a pretty high projected team total right now at 25. It had a pretty big line movement at a plus half a point, so that's pretty big. San Diego is projected at 23.5 points right now, and their line hasn't moved at all. So right now, this is looking to be like a possible shootout, and that's exactly what we want to see in a fantasy game, of course. So if you wanted to stack, like Phillip Rivers and Gates, and then run it back with, even Greg Olsen, that would be really different. Doing a game stack with 2 tight ends, you don't see that very often. Or you could go like with a Cam Newton, Greg Olsen stack, and then put Antonio Gates, or it's so many different things that you could do. You could go Cam and Ted Ginn, and then go into Antonio Gates. Again, you can get really creative with this. This is definitely something that I would do in tournaments, but again, if Kuechly doesn't play, I wouldn't be scared to play Gates in cash games at all. All right, so finishing up the stacks here, we have Jameis, Winston, and Mike Evans rounding it out. And this, again, could be a popular stack, but it also could not be. So first off, I jinxed Mr. Evans last week. I had him on my thumbnail. I was really hyping him up. I talked about how consistent he had been throughout the season, and he ended up posting his worst real-life numbers and his worst fantasy numbers on the season. So again, apologies for that. That said, I'm going to go right back to him again this week for a couple of different reasons. So first off, he's facing the Saints team, and again, I'm not even going to dive into the numbers because it's pretty, like I said, I say it almost every week, but it's common knowledge how bad this Saints team really is on defense. But it's interesting, I'm not sure how popular Mike Evans is really going to be. Now, I think he's going to be popular, but there's a couple different reasons that make me think that he possibly could not be popular. So first off, like I already mentioned, he's coming off of his worst game of the season, so that could play a little bit of a factor into recency bias and all that good stuff. But number two is the pricing. Evans is the most expensive wide receiver on the board this week at $8,900, more expensive than Antonio Brown, Odell Beckham, Julio Jones, T.Y. Hilton, guys like that, guys that are usually more expensive than Evans, if not the same exact price. And it's 100% given the matchup, of course. DraftKings has done this quite a bit in this season where they fluctuate pricing based off the matchup, or at least the perceived matchup. And it's making things a little bit more difficult, but it also makes it a little bit more fun. Obviously, the harder the pricing, the more challenging and more fun I think it is personally. But anyway, so I just don't know how many people are actually going to justify themselves playing Mike Evans over a guy like Antonio, over an Odell Beckham who has a good matchup this week, over a Julio Jones. Now, Julio's a little bit of a different situation. He's got a tough matchup on the road against his Rams team. Also, he's dealing with that turf toe. He hasn't practiced much of the week. So I think Julio is kind of a free square this week that you don't need to play. That said, Antonio Brown is also in a tough matchup because Big Ben struggles on the road, and they're going to be on the road against Buffalo. So, again, I mean, I don't know how many people are going to use this kind of reasoning. Maybe I'm thinking a little bit too much into it, but I think Mike Evans is definitely a better play than guys like Antonio Brown and Odell Beckham. And for that very reason, I'm considering pairing him with Jameis Winston. Winston's been pretty consistent this season. Can't complain too much, and I'd be surprised if he didn't throw for 3 touchdown passes in this game. All right, so moving into the wide receiver position, first up I have LeVeon Bell, and last week a lot of people were trying to decide between LeVeon Bell and David Johnson, and it's going to be the same exact thing this week. Quite a few people tried to play both of them. I didn't go that route. I actually ended up going David Johnson over LeVeon. Ended up working out pretty well for me, obviously. This week could be the exact opposite in my eyes, where more people play LeVeon than David, because I think Le'Veon Bell actually has a pretty good matchup. So at first glance, you would probably think that on the road against Buffalo is not the best matchup in the world, and it really isn't for guys like Big Ben and Antonio Brown. But Le'Veon Bell is one of those guys that you could say is matchup proof, and I guess you could say Antonio Brown is as well. But Big Ben struggles on the road against just about any team on the road. But anyway, Buffalo is actually allowing nearly 120 rushing yards per game at home, and they're allowing nearly 140 rushing yards per game in the last 3 games. So if Le'Veon can even get half of that, if you add in the fact that the receiving threat this guy is, that alone is pretty much all I need to hear, honestly. So, I mean, if you look up fantasy points per game allowed to running backs, Buffalo's kind of middle of the road, so they're kind of just average in that department, but they have given up some pretty big games to guys like Jay Ajayi. Even Forte went off on them. David Johnson had a pair of rushing touchdowns early against them in the season. So I think Le'Veon's going to be perfectly fine in this particular situation. He's been a stud the past month of games. The lowest fantasy points he's put up in the past 4 games was 26.2 DK points, and that was last week against the New York Giants. His price actually came down a couple $100. So, again, I think I like Le'Veon the most out of any running back this week, but it's pretty close between him and DJ, as it always is. So, next up I have Jeremy Hill, and we've seen a pretty hefty price bump on him compared to $4,300 last week and $5,800 this week, but given the matchup, it makes perfect sense. The Browns have allowed the 2nd most rushing yards on the season. They've allowed the 3rd most rushing touchdowns, and they've allowed the 4th most fantasy points per game to running backs in the NFL. And Jeremy Hill went off the last time he faced him for over 160 rushing yards with a rushing touchdown. He's getting more looks in the passing game now, and the price still just does not seem like too much to pick this guy. And I don't really see a lineup where I'm not playing him in cash games this week. So finishing off the running backs here, I have a tournament play in Todd Gurley. And I know Gurley's been pretty much a letdown so far this season, but this seems to be like an interesting spot for him. So first off, this Atlanta Falcons team actually is pretty vulnerable against the receiving running back. And although Todd Gurley is not your prototypical receiving running back, and he's not really even been getting involved in the passing game too much recently, he did have a pretty good stretch of games where he was averaging over about 35 receiving yards or so per game with about 5 targets. So if we can see that again out of him, it would make perfect sense for the Rams to go back to that this week, because the Atlanta Falcons have allowed the most receptions to running backs at 94, the most receiving yards against running backs at 779, and the most receiving touchdowns to running backs at 5. And they're allowing the second most fantasy points per game overall to running backs at 29.7. Only the San Diego Chargers are allowing more. This is obviously a tournament play, but I think it's worth taking a risk at this price. Again, I think this could be a defensive game. The Rams defense is very stingy at home, and this Atlanta Falcons team could be with a hurt Julio Jones, so it'll be interesting to see what happens. All right, so moving on to wide receivers now. First up, we have Odell Beckham, and he's played very, very well these past 2 weeks. And he has another really good matchup here going up against the Dallas Cowboys. And this Dallas defense has actually had a little bit of a easy season, in my opinion, because this Cowboys offense is so good at playing the ball control game that it hid how poor they really were on the opposite side of the ball for most of the season. But it's finally showing and finally pulling through in the numbers. Dallas has allowed the most receptions in the NFL. They've allowed to wide receivers. They've allowed the 7th most receiving yards in the NFL to wide receivers, and they've allowed the 2nd most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. So add all that in, and Odell Beckham, I mean, this guy's on the field all the time. He has the 2nd highest snap percentage of any wide receiver in the NFL. I think he has one of the top 5 target percentages. He's averaging over 10 targets per game. And, this guy is a yak, yard after catch monster. This guy is always getting these quick little slants and somehow finds a way to take them into the end zone. So definitely looks like a really good spot for him. It's not that bad of a price given how well he's played the past few weeks. So I'm definitely going to take a chance on him in some lineups, and hopefully it'll pay out. Next up, we have T.Y. Hilton, and I was all over this guy in the primetime slate last week, and I'm going to go right back to him again this week. I will be the first to tell you that I think this Houston secondary does not get enough credit because I think they're very good. That said, they just don't scare me enough. I mean, I just mentioned it with Odell Beckham. This guy is on the field a ton, has a huge snap percentage, has a very high target percentage, is averaging 9.5 targets per game. And I think that the Colts are just going to be very creative in finding ways to get this guy the ball, just like they are each and every week. And I think T.Y. Hilton's speed will be just enough to get enough points to make this $7,500 price tag worthwhile, even given the matchup. So I really, really wanted to play Sammy Watkins last week, but I just didn't have enough confidence in him because I wasn't sure what he was going to be able to do with the injury hindering him, how many times he was actually even going to play on the field and snaps he was going to get. And I saw just enough to know that I should play Watkins in a couple of lineups this week. So it isn't the best matchup going up against this Pittsburgh Steelers defense. That said, I think this could be a situation where volume will outweigh the matchup. We could see him get like 12 targets or so, and he catches 6 of them for 80 yards and a touchdown. If that's the case at this price point, that's literally all you need. You would be thrilled with that stat line. And depending on how much confidence you have in him, I would say he's borderline cash game playable. He played on almost every single Tyrod Taylor's drop back last week, and I see no reason why his snap percentage wouldn't go up again this week. So I like him this week. And again, like I said, it's just a case of I can't imagine Tyrod Taylor rather throw the ball to Charles Clay or Marquise Goodwin or somebody like that over Sammy Watkins when he knows Watkins is slowly but surely getting more and more healthy. So all in all, I think Watkins is definitely a good tournament play this week. And depending on how your lineup construction goes in cash games, he may be able to sneak in there, but I don't think you need to do that. Okay, so finishing up here with a couple of tournament tight ends and a defense. First up, we have CJ Fedorowicz, and I like Fedorowicz. So first off, he is a really good pivot play off of Ladarius Green. Hopefully you guys watched my sleeper/value picks video last week because I shared Ladarius Green in that video, and he ended up playing very, very well. And because of that, his price skyrocketed. He is now $3,900, just like CJ is. And again, I think CJ Fedorowicz is a much safer player than Ladarius Green, but I don't think he has anywhere near the ceiling Ladarius Green has. So
Really depends on what kind of contest you're entering, on what you want to play. I think in cash games, if you have to play somebody around his price range, CJ is definitely the safer play. But again, like I said, Ladarius Green has the potential to drop another 30-point game, no problem in my opinion. So, but CJ Fedorowicz has been getting a fair share of targets. The Colts are bottom 10 in fantasy points allowed per game to tight ends. So, last week, Brock Osweiler had a relatively good matchup, but it wasn't a very good situation with the snow on the field, very, very cold. Just wasn't a very good scenario for him. So, again, not the stingiest defense that he's going up against in the world against Indianapolis Colts this week. So I don't mind playing CJ in hopes that Brock Osweiler can toss him a touchdown or two. But my favorite play on the board, I think, this week is Gary Barnidge. So the Cincinnati Bengals team has turned into the most vulnerable team in the NFL against opposing tight ends, even more so than the Detroit Lions. They've allowed the second most receptions, they've allowed the most receiving yards, and tied for the second most receiving touchdowns, and the most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends in the NFL right now. And Gary Barnidge is a really, really good play. I love the price point. I was all over this guy even before we heard that RG3 was going to come back, and I actually think I liked him a bit more when RG3 wasn't coming back, but we'll have to see what happens. I haven't seen what the Vegas line has done yet since we know clear-cut 100% that RG3 is playing. I would be really interested to see what the Vegas line would do. That said, I think Barnidge is still a really, really good play, and I'm very interested to see what his ownership is going to be like, but I like the play a lot, and hopefully it works out. So finishing up here with a defense, I like the Bills this week. I already alluded to it quite a bit earlier in the video that Big Ben struggles on the road, and the Bills average about 1.5 takeaways per game at home. I think that the Steelers are still going to score their points for sure, so you're definitely hoping for those few turnovers, and hopefully you can get a cheap blocked field goal or something like that return for a touchdown, something along those lines. So I definitely think the Bills are a good tournament play, and hopefully we can get a couple of turnovers forced and get some good points out of them this week. So that's going to do it for this video. I want to say thank you for tuning in. As always, be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't. Be sure to check out my sleeper/value picks video that should be out on Friday. Be sure to follow me on Twitter to stay up to date on my picks throughout the weekend. And thank you for tuning in. Later.